For this. So first part, really, I wanted to get this in this week before everyone kind of uh, took off for Utah and also headed off to holidays. So this is a very high level generic overview of sessions and the applications that we use for session tracking, access control, and management at on-site events. Let me start, and then I'm going to hand this over to Greg, and then Bridget, I'd like you to kind of interject at any point in time just regarding comments or insight as well. So
Okay.
in particular, if you see anything that I'm discussing that may be incorrect, which I do sometimes,
Okay.
and same as you, Greg. So I'll start with real basic stuff that we kind of outlined in our presentation, which was what Sentinel does, which is the primary application we use for all our session tracking, access control, and the items that are listed here. So materials distribution falls under that application, and our POS app. So POS is an actual app that's used on Android and can be used on iOS as well. Sentinel does session listing and session content information, so just details of the session. Sentinel consumes APIs, session scans, allow and deny lists. There's session monitoring attached to Sentinel as well. And in the future, the original intent was always to have a survey tool as well as part of Sentinel and the overall application. That just hasn't been kind of defined on the roadmap or architected and how it will happen. So just a quick note on the API side as well. Right now, currently, Sentinel only has one API available, which is for the allow list, meaning that anybody using Sentinel can use an API to submit badge IDs against a specific session ID. So is that correct, Greg? Did I describe that more or less correctly?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of APIs in Sentinel, but yeah, that's the only one that is accessible by an external party.
Yeah, so, and that's a good point. Greg can talk later about the actual in-facing or internal APIs that Sentinel has available. But yeah, right now our allow list is the only external customer API. So historically, if anyone's interested in a little bit of history, Sentinel was designed to basically replace a number of different separate individual applications that we had used for years and years. So it, in part, it replaced something called Liam, which was kind of a PC application we used to keep track of configurations and events. So it's how we actually set up the app that was used for session scanning. There was also another application separate from Liam, which was a web app that kept all the actual scans. So basically a listing of scans that could be downloaded and viewed and some basic reports. There was also a separate session monitor application. There was also another tool, which was kind of a filtering report lookup tool called Rupert. There was another application called Serial Updater. And then there was a number of various web APIs. And there was also a survey piece, which was used in conjunction with our sessions, which was a derivative from Regplex. So Regplex has a survey kind of feature functionality built into it that can be configured and set up. And that was used to manage all our session surveys, which was primarily only used by one client, which was UBM Informa. And that was kind of its own build and instance that we recycled from event to event for implementing session surveys. So I guess what Sentinel did in a lot of ways was it condensed a number of different applications, actual Windows apps, and took them all and condensed it down into one tool. So what we ended up with early this year when we released Sentinel officially in the spring of 2019 was one tool that took place of many other tools, and it was all web-based. So it was quite a change for everybody, and Bridget can attest to using tools like Liam and Sessions Portal and the Monitor and Rupert and Serial Updater and the various apps that, Sentinel was a very welcome change.
Yeah. On a lot of fronts, but yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So, so structure of Sentinel, and this is an older presentation I had, but I wanted to kind of use it to describe some of the basics that really distinguish Sentinel from what we had done previously as ITN, and what the key points were. So key thing is, it's multi-tenant, multi-event. So at any given time, Sentinel could be handling session scanning for dozens of events. And within that event that it's doing scanning for, it can be managing, 10 sessions at one location, one venue, or it could be managing literally, thousands of sessions at numerous hundreds of locations and at maybe half a dozen or a dozen different venues. So it is a very scalable application, and the apps that work with it, we really haven't seen any cases yet where we've run into any slowdowns, any problems like on a major, data level. As far as scalability, from our perspective, I think Sentinel, we have yet to even remotely reach limits. And Greg's done a lot of monitoring on the Azure side, on the Azure tenant side, to look at application usage and database usage, as well as APIs. And we've rarely even, got to, Greg, what would you say is kind of our max so far?
I think when they opened the doors on the first day of Magic has been the highest volume in a condensed period, and that's been as high as about 500 scans a minute.
Okay.
But we load tested it to something crazy like 10,000 scans a minute before we launched it, and that was, it could have gone much higher than that even. So yeah, that's not something that we need to worry about, at least.
Yeah, no, I think that's a big thing we don't need to worry about. If it ever comes up in any of your discussions or questions as far as scalability and just, how we can, use this tool, sky's the limit from our perspective, technically speaking.
One other quick note, like you'd think Mobile World Congress would probably be the highest volume event, right? But because it's so spread out over such long period during the day, like the the condensed volume in a short period was the highest it ever got. There was probably half of what it got when they opened the doors at Magic, and that's something that probably most people don't realize.
Yeah. And when Greg talks about scans per minute, that's kind of just one aspect of the intake on Sentinel. We've got other access points, such as allow list. So if a customer, for example, is submitting allow lists to multiple sessions, then that's another kind of area where the application is processing and handling all that data and information. As well as all the internal APIs that are used by the apps themselves, like the Access app, materials distribution, and the POS app. Again, I think Access is going to be the one that's used mostly in terms of high volume, but it has an API connection back to Sentinel where it receives all its updates and changes and how it's activated and controlled. So that's, device setup and activation is all done in Sentinel. It's structured very similar to how we do it in lead retrieval. So, when you have the app loaded on a device and you need to set it up for an event, you're going to go through an activation and setup process that's very similar to lead retrieval. You're going to activate it against a venue or a location. Is that correct, Greg? What are the two different areas?
You can activate against a venue or a location.
Yeah.
You get the same data. The only advantage to activating to a location directly is that then you don't have to select it on the device. So it's not often used, but there are cases where it's handy.
Yeah. So again, that just comes up as a QR code. Use the camera on the app, and that activation code allows the device to know what it needs to consume and what it needs to update. So you can reactivate as many times as you want to and change throughout the event. But once you activate against that location or venue, it should keep updating any changes against that. The other thing is in Sentinel, and you guys may know this already, but it's kind of obvious, but all sessions are listed there, all scans are listed there, and there's internal tools and grids where you can do filtering and lookup and checks. You can drill down to the individual devices themselves. You can drill down to individual scans, see all the specific details. You can sort and filter and so forth. And we've used technology that makes it very fast and very responsive in terms of doing those filters and sorts.
I have a quick question on Redwood. So is
Sure.
the idea that we would also create those events, or who creates those events in Redwood normally?
Yeah, Tace, that's a good question. I guess I kind of skipped over that one, didn't I? Similar to lead retrieval and the other apps, Insignia and so forth, is we need a source of truth for our events. So Sentinel can't function without an event, and how it gets that information is from Redwood. You can import that event into Sentinel by simply using the event name or code and add it. And then there's an internal API that is connected between Sentinel and Redwood. And Greg, can you maybe just speak to how the Redwood piece works with Sentinel?
Yeah, I mean, as you guys probably know, Redwood is a legacy application that we've had for a very, very long time. And as Chris mentioned, it's sort of the source of truth for events. It's very important for all the applications to have an agreed upon ID and code for the event, so they all know they're talking about the same thing. And especially in the case of Sentinel, because the ID of the event is getting encoded on the badge, so we need to know which event the badge was from when it gets scanned. So what we did was to prevent people from having to type all this information into all the different applications, we tacked some services on top of the legacy Redwood application that would allow more modern applications like Insignia, Sentinel, etc., to pull the data out of Redwood automatically. So it's very easy. All the PMs do it themselves. You just have to go into a screen in Sentinel or Insignia or whichever application you're in and look up your event. You can look it up by date range, by code, by ID, whatever you have, and then you hit one import button and that's it.
Yeah. Guys, one of the things that you'll hear us kind of harp on and consistently mention is the importance of, first of all, creating the event in Redwood, but creating the correct basic information about your event. So that means the event start and event end date, because those start and end dates, they tie into a lot of different functionality across Sentinel and across various other applications. So if you enter in the wrong dates and information on your event, it does impact application functioning. And Greg has lots of stories about,
Yeah, it's something that I think the PMs really don't have a good knowledge in that area. Like a lot of times they'll enter date ranges that are several weeks long, even though the event is only 2 or 3 days. And I don't know why they do that. I think they maybe think it's easier for testing or something. But Redwood has 2 separate sets of dates. There's a move in and move out date, which would be better used for that kind of purpose. And then there's the actual event start and event end date. And the different applications drive, some subtle functionality changes based on those dates that then can be messed up if you're entering in the wrong dates. Like in the case of Sentinel, it won't allow scans if they're too far outside the date range of the event. And that's because we've had, years in the past, people choosing events from the wrong year and all kinds of crazy things, right? So we have to prevent those kind of problems. So it's not within a certain number of days of the event, it won't work. A lot of little UI changes happen as well, like the session schedule control that you can look at. It defaults to the week because it only displays a week-long view. It defaults to the week that you've set as the start date of your event. So if you set the start date as 2 weeks before it actually started, then you're looking at a blank scheduler and wondering why there's no sessions on it. So there's a lot of little things like that. I guess as Chris mentioned, setting the dates correctly is very important.
Yeah, what Greg will show here shortly after I just scan through the rest of these slides is the event setup section in Sentinel that'll give you an idea. I mean, I'll bring it up now, and I'm sure Greg, you can mention it later, but things just like time zones are really critical. We've had people enter the wrong time zones and then go, well, why are my scan dates all wrong, right? Things like that. So there's a whole multitude of not only start end dates, but time. It all, I mean, when
There's
you
a few
think about
basic,
it,
a few basic things like that are extremely critical to the success of the data at the event, and it quite often is not done correctly. So I think that's an area where you guys can really help us with.
Yeah, and I think it starts with just conceptual, basic understanding of the data, the event data, because we're in the event data business. Things like a scan date and time are important. They form the fundamental, foundation of everything we do. So if you don't get that scan date and time right, everything that flows out from that and up is going to be tainted and incorrect. So, simple steps at the start will often prevent a lot of time and intervention and troubleshooting and debugging that happens, during the event or after the event. So Bridget, you've been knee deep in this many times, so you know yourself, what proper preparation and planning can do, as opposed to trying to troubleshoot something because someone entered or set up something incorrectly before the event. Right?
Definitely. I mean, it's a classic case of you're trying to help someone troubleshoot a computer and you realize it's not even on. You have to step back so far. Yeah.
Yeah, that's exactly it. So basic concept behind all this, kind of starts, aside from, the date, time pieces and the event information that we talked about, is within the overall access control structure, there's a basic hierarchy that exists within Sentinel, and it starts with, before venues, there's the event, but then there's venues, locations, and sessions. So it's sort of like a 1, 2, 3 step that exists in the hierarchy. And this is kind of, hope I can do this right. Yeah, the event, the venue, locations, and then under each location, you'll have sessions assigned to those locations. And I'll have Greg maybe talk a bit more about that within Sentinel. We also developed some access control rule types that essentially cover everything that could potentially happen when it comes to session tracking or session scanning. So in a simple world, we can think of, session scanning as you have a badge, you have a person, you have an app, and you're going to scan that, and then you get an actual record that has a time date stamp associated to it and a name, so that person passed your point of access or location at that certain instance in time. However, what we have is, with many of our customers and events, we have rules that are tied to that scan. And those rules come in a variety of different forms, from a grant rule type, which is basically saying, we'll grant you access if you have this code associated to your registration record. So that could be as simple as you have an exhibitor registration code on your badge, so we're going to grant you access into that area. So that's a grant code. Deny code is the same thing, except instead of granting you access and saying that you're allowed to pass that point of entry, it says you're denied access. And waitlist codes are used, not so common, but that's another rule type. Allow list by far is probably our most common rule type that we encounter and that most of our customers like to use, simply because of its flexibility of saying, I don't need to worry about a person's registration type or not. All I need to know is that they, as an individual, their registration record, their badge ID, gets access into these areas or these sessions. So allow list is actually something we used to call whitelist, is something that we, sorry about my Slack blowing up there, is something that is used quite common by a lot of our AES type of events and corporate events that we do. So what else do we have here? Day Pass. Day Pass, actually, this is an older presentation, so Day Pass actually is available, isn't it, Bridget?
It's available as of right now. It is available in alpha, and Jeff is going to push that version to production this week. So within the next week, it will actually be fully available in production.
Okay, can you explain to me how Day Pass works? Just
sure. So Day Pass, yeah, I use those at IBC. It is pretty seldom used. I think it's used twice a year at this point, but I think it's a great offering. What that means is the client can specify that certain people, either reg types, or they can make it a line item, something that attendees can purchase a Day Pass. And they can specify that the Day Pass is good for 1 or 2 or 3 or more days. And it's not a 24-hour pass. It is a 1 calendar day pass. So beginning show that day to end show that day. And so say you decide to sell single day passes, as soon as the attendee who has purchased one of these passes and it's on their badge, and we track it by code. So we know that, for example, at IBC, we knew that the reg type BRZ, which used to be bronze pass, were entitled to a single day pass. So the first time that person scanned into an event by way of bit flipping, we tracked which day on which they activated their day pass. And so they would be allowed to continue to go to any sessions they wanted on that day that were marked as day pass eligible sessions. And then as soon as the next day came, the same check would take place where it would look at the previously flipped bits and realize that, oh, yesterday's bit was already flipped. They've already consumed the day pass, so they can no longer attend sessions. That's basically how it works. Yeah. And that's, again, something that's very, very important, that the dates in Sentinel are set correctly, because it does rely on the date range of that event to determine which days, on what day day passes begin.
And Bridget, I know you already told me before, but is it right that the first day of the event is the last bit that's available, or?
That's right, and that's sort of the way that Jeff figured out the best way to manage this, because there's no way to otherwise anticipate a calendar day. So how he technically has it set up is the very last bit on the badge, which is number 224, will always be designated as the first day of the event, and it counts backwards. And that's how it knows, quote unquote, which bit is attributed to which day.
Okay, so yeah, we're hoping this will get used a little bit more often. I think it just is something that it just needs to be packaged and information communicated effectively to the rest of the team, broadly, so they know how it works and the benefits of using it. The sixth one here is flag. Now, flag is kind of a placeholder for a access control rule type that we haven't yet defined, but we feel might exist sometime in the future. So it's kind of a placeholder, but we're hoping we can come up with what it actually will do and what how it will work sometime in the future.
So it doesn't have any functionality, this section in flag?
No functionality. Yeah. You'll see it in Sentinel. It's there, but you can't actually edit it or use it in any way or form. It just simply exists as a placeholder right now. Okay. The other thing I just want to finish with here is are the mobile applications. So right now, there are 3 mobile applications that work in conjunction with Sentinel: Access, Swag, and Wallet, or POS, I guess is, we actually ended up calling it just POS. And Access is by far used the most. It does all the session tracking and access control. Swag is materials distribution. We'll talk about that later at some point. And POS is fairly recent, released in September. Bridget used it as well at IBC this year. And what's great about that is it's a way to essentially, you know, add or deduct credits from someone's purse. So it uses the purse feature on NFC. And it can also, I don't know if it's actually implemented yet, but it can do virtual POS as well. Probably something in the future. Bridget, is that?
No,
Yeah.
that's not implemented yet.
Yeah, so right now it's NFC only. The screenshot here shows version 208, which is a very, very early version. And this coming week, I think Bridget's going to be deploying and using version 229, correct?
Yes, next week, starting Monday.
Yeah. So we've made a lot of enhancements and changes. Yeah, next Tuesday at a Microsoft event. So we've made a lot of changes and updates to the Access app, some new features, functionality, and it's iterative. So we're always updating it every month or two as far as the feature set goes. So what I want to do now.
Sorry to interrupt. How do you
okay.
communicate those changes? Is that on a specific Slack channel? Is it on? So you're talking that does these applications, for example, updated so that it has new features? How is that communicated once it's available to everybody?
Yeah. So it'll be posted in the product update channel, the general one of Ventry. Yeah, and also we'll have an internal communication as well. So I'll go out to the team in the specific Sentinel channel or mobile channel. Yeah. So I think as we work together more often, what you guys will have are previews of these updates and changes. So prior to release, I'm sure we'll have you and the team to preview the apps, do some user testing before we do a wider and broader company-wide, customer-wide release. So key thing here to remember is Access, Swag, and POS are all internal facing applications. So the customers don't actually use these. These are applications that we load on our devices, our phones, and that we train people, temporary staff or our own staff to use on site for use. So they're never put in the hands of the actual customer or given to them. Like you would the event app or lead retrieval even. Okay.
Chris, a quick question. Going back to the dates in like a Redwood, for example, if someone has put the wrong date in Redwood and you've imported it into Sentinel, how do you kind of update that? Can you, like, if you go and change it in Redwood, does it automatically pull through? Can you kind of re-import it, or is it an issue basically?
Yeah, I'll let Greg answer that one.
If you realize after the fact, like after you've imported it, and then it gets edited in Redwood after, no, it won't automatically pull through. You'd have to edit the date in Sentinel manually.
Okay, so like you can manually do it, but you just have to do it in two places if that ever came up.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, cool, thank you.
Yeah, that's why it's so important to get it correct in Redwood the first time, because I mean it is fixable, but then you have to remember to go and fix it in everywhere where you may have imported it already.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Okay, cool.
Yeah, I suppose one of the things is probably to maybe update that service as well to handle updates, but that's something else.
I think that application will get replaced sooner than we would get to that anyway.
Get fixed. Yeah. Yeah, we all know Redwood is quite an old tree, so it definitely needs to be changed out. So we're trying to figure out the best approach for that currently. The good thing is we've written, fairly, new services around that we could use and, hook the new app into. But anyway, Greg, can you maybe do screen share in Sentinel and just walk through some of the basic setup sections in the next, I guess, rest of
Yeah, sure.
the talk here. Kind of touch on, event creation, basic session, the import, adding rules, and then just how typically activation works. So I know maybe a few of you guys have seen some of this or even done it on site, but I think just for recording purposes and for everyone's purpose, we can do the start to finish. And please, by all means, ask questions as Greg walks through this.
Yeah, you guys can see that?
Yeah.
Okay. So first thing you'll notice is this is the test environment. You may have seen this with our other applications as well. There's always a test environment, which is just -test. If you want to go to production, you would remove that -test from the URL. This is still itn.com, but this is changing very soon to eventscloud.com. Actually, that may work in test already, but I'll just stick with this one that I know works for this demo. So I guess the first thing I could show you quickly is how to import an event. So when you first log in, this is the screen you'll be at. It'll show you the events that are currently running, coming up soon, or recently ended. In test, you see way less events because people don't always import their events to test. They typically only do if there's in a lot of sessions or something they want to test out there first without putting a bunch of junk data into production. So it's something I recommend. It's something that it isn't really done that often, but it's a great place for people to learn too. Like they're free to import events and set up all the data they want there. They can't hurt anything as when they're in test. And that's another thing with the dates too. When people enter, like you'll see this Sentinel test event as an example, it's entered with the entire year as its date range. So it will always show up in the running events list. So that's intentional. So you can always go into it quickly because it's got a whole bunch of data all set up already. But when people do that with real events, here's another issue, right? It'll sit in this running events list for the entire year. So to look at all the events we have in test, you'd go to the events list and then you can filter them, sort them however you need. But if you want to import one that is not there yet, import. And now this is a screen that essentially is going to search Redwood for you for an event. If you know the code or the Redwood ID, you can just type it in and make it easier. If you don't, you can just hit search and you'll get a list of ones that are coming up after a defaulted date range there. So I'll just pick one that I know is not in test that we can import. So I'm pretty sure GDC 2020 isn't in test. So there we go. So this is a good thing for you to see. Now, if this was Insignia, you'd be done. The event, everything you need for the event is already imported. But in Sentinel, it kicks you to a set time zone screen right off the bat. The reason we have to do this is because Redwood does not have the time zone for us, which is really unfortunate. An application like Insignia can get by without needing to know the time zone. But for Sentinel and session scanning, it's extremely important. All of the scans, everything in the database, anything with a time is stored in UTC, which prevents all kinds of problems that we used to have in the past. The old sessions portal that Sentinel replaced was actually storing them all in Mountain Time because that's where the server was in Salt Lake. So that's why you have to set the time zone initially here. It sends you the screen. It tells you how important it is. It's the only thing you can do on this screen. And yet it's still a step that gets missed quite often somehow or set incorrectly. So I'll set mine to, we'll say this is in Pacific time. And now, as soon as I do that, now I'm finished. And one other thing to note with that too is knowing how important it is, the time zone gets set when the event is important and how important it is that it gets set correctly. I even log in the application log who set the time zone and to what time zone they set it to. So we know, like we've had cases where the time zone is set to somewhere on the opposite side of the world somehow, and you wonder how. we know when and by who that was done. So now we've got our fresh event here. The first thing you'd need to do is go set up locations, like we're going back to that hierarchy that Chris showed in one of his slides. You get a default venue when you import an event, so it's just named default venue. And that's because a lot of events, they might only have 8 to 10 locations they're going to scan at. They only need one venue, so there it's already created for them. If it's a more complex event, it's going to have many venues. Now you can add the additional venues. Something I think some people have not realized and other people have is that if you do, like, let's say have 3 venues, you don't need to keep this one. You can change it to, if this event is in Vegas and we want an MGM venue, and then say we also need one for ARIA. And now we've got our 2 venues, and we don't have to have that default venue anymore if we don't want it. It will show up in lists and things where you can pick venue. So if you don't want it cluttering up your lists, you can just rename it to one of your real venues. The next step in the hierarchy would be to create the locations under the venues. So these are most typically going to be rooms at the convention center. But they could be anything. It could be someone's booth out on the show floor. It could be an area outside. Sometimes it's guided tours that are getting done at events that are large enough, and the guided tour becomes a location. So even though it's typically going to be a room, just keep in mind it could be anything. Same with venues. Venues typically are going to be the different convention centers. But they don't have to be. A venue, like I like to tell people, it's just a logical container, really. So you could have, say MGM has, and it has many rooms on each floor there. So if you have a volume of sessions that is big enough, you may want to separate it out into venues for MGM floor 1, MGM floor 2. This is something that requires some careful, consideration and planning. And the reasons there's many reasons. You can it'll be easier to select your location and things like that, but also technical. When you're activating the device, you need to get all of the data for anything that can happen in that venue. And if you have huge allow lists for every session and things like that, this can become really burdensome for the device to handle. If you split it up into enough different venues, then you keep the data at a manageable size. But this is one where it really depends on the event, right? I mean, there could be hundreds of sessions, but if there's no allow lists in use, then it's not that much data. You don't really need to break it up into too many venues. So this is where you kind of have to really have experience in the session scanning world to start making these kind of decisions of how much do I need to break up my event into different venues and such. So I'll drill into one and I'll show you how to make a location. So you can go search locations. We don't have any. You can upload locations as well. Locations, if your event has capacity on the locations, most events don't, I find, but if you do, you can have a spreadsheet of all the locations and their capacities and some other aux fields as well if you need, and then you can upload all that. But if you just need one like I need now, I'll just create it on the screen. So we'll create one in ARIA. Capacity is optional, but I'll fill it in here. Often the client will have a specific ID for the location that we can track here in this field. It's optional. Most of these fields have tooltips too, as you can see, to explain. The beacon fields are all optional. That's for some future functionality that doesn't exist yet. And this is something we recently added as well, an additional 5 aux fields for locations. If you've used Insignia, you've probably seen that, or Regplex as well. There's always aux fields for additional things that we don't know what they're going to want to store. Maybe it's the color lanyard or something that is allowed in there, or the tracks of sessions that are going to be in that location. You never know what a client might want to store in there. So I'll create this location. Now we've got, so now we've got one location. I feel like I've been talking quite a bit. Any questions on that so far?
All clear.
Okay, so once you have your venues and locations all set up, the next thing would be creating sessions. So we've got no sessions yet, and similar to locations, you can just create one manually, or you can upload them from Excel. So with sessions, more often than not, people are going to upload them from Excel because there's, you know, once you've got a few dozen or more, it's just gonna be a lot easier that way. I'll quickly show you what that looks like. When on the upload, you can download the template in Excel that'll have all the fields you need to fill in. You fill them all in, then you come back here and you upload it. It's pretty simple. You can also export all the sessions from here. So if you need to make a minor change, like let's say all of the sessions were entered as starting on the hour, and the client has come back and said for whatever reason we need every session event-wide to start at 5 minutes after the hour. You don't want to drill into 100 sessions and add 5 minutes to the start time to every one. You could export them all from here, do that in the column in Excel in one step, re-upload them, and because it can match the sessions up based on their unique code, it's smart enough to update those sessions rather than create new ones. So it's an easy way to make a wholesale change if you're in a situation where you need to do that. So I'll just create one manually here on the screen. This screen's a little more complex, so I'll step through what all these fields are for. First of all, we need to know what location the session is going to be at, and in order to get the locations, you need to select the venue first. It's a hierarchical. So if I select ARIA, it'll populate the possible list of locations there, which I only made one, so I'll select it. Now, very important, every session needs to have a unique code. This is required, and yeah, it mentions there in the tooltip, short codes without white space are preferred. These codes are going to show up everywhere. They're going to show up on the app, on the display. They're going to be used by third parties with APIs. They're going to be in reports. So it's nice if you can make codes that are somewhat human readable. And so by that, I just mean like if you have a code like that, maybe it's a session on cooking. So maybe this is cook 18, rather than, some clients will just have code that looks like that, and it'll work fine so long as it's unique. But it makes things just a little bit harder to troubleshoot when you see it, because you really can't tell looking at that what session that might be. Description is optional. So start date and end date of the session obviously are very important. These start date and end dates are in the time of the event, because of course nobody else but us think in UTC time. They're always going to get the events or the sessions sent to them in the time of the event. So that's one of the reasons why it's very important for Sentinel to know the time zone, like that very first step. Because what you can do here, it's defaulted to today between 8 and 9 a.m. So that's fine. I'll leave that. But what it's going to do when we save this is going to convert those into UTC time behind the scenes. And it's actually quite complex what happens there under the hood, because it has to account for savings time changes and things like that. I can show you that a little bit more later if there's time as well. But just know that that happens all under the hood. You just enter the local start and end time here. The offsets, these are very important as well. So these are defaulting to 0. So if we were to leave it this way, what that means is on the app, the session isn't going to roll over and allow scanning on that app until exactly 8 a.m., which is obviously no good if the session's supposed to be starting at 8 a.m. People are going to be wanting to get there before the session starts and be able to scan in and sit down. So a typical default you might see here would be -15, so it'll allow scanning up to 15 minutes before the start time of the session. But this can be whatever you need it to be. If there's back-to-back sessions in the same room, this becomes really problematic. You can only go back so far because there may be another session that's still running from previously in that location. So this is another case where some careful planning is required. Another common thing to see here is first session of the day. Quite often you'll see people put in -60 because there's nothing else in the room before it. And in the case of big keynotes and things like that, where there's going to be thousands of people, we know 15 minutes isn't enough to get them all into the room. So it's definitely going to have to be a lot more in advance than that. So -60, or the maximum you can go up to is -80. So quite often I'll see people, if it's the big giant keynote with thousands of people, they'll just put -180 to be safe. So you can start scanning people in there up to 3 hours in advance. And this is a common request from clients on site too. Like say it was a big session and we had it set at -15, a big line forms, and they say, oh, well, the room's empty, we want to let people start scanning into it. Well, that won't be on the app because we've got a -15 offset. So what you can do in that case, you can pull Sentinel. Sentinel is all a fully responsive website as well, by the way. So any internal Aventry employee can pull Sentinel up on their phone and access any of these screens. So the easiest thing to do would be, if you're standing there with the client staring at this big line and they say, we want to start scanning people in, come here, change this to -30 or however far back you need it to be, save it, and then as soon as those devices at that location sync, the session will appear and they can start scanning. In the new version of Access, that the default for syncing is every 5 minutes. So it would mean within 5 minutes, every device would be able to sync, but there's also a Sync Now button on the apps. So you could go and hit Sync Now and they'd be good to go as soon as this was saved. So it's a real easy thing to do if that situation comes up, but it's something that I think in the heat of the moment, sometimes people don't realize. So the end offset is similar, but this is how long before or after the listed end time of the session scanning will be allowed. So you might wonder, why would you ever want to make that negative? And the reason for that would be if you have back-to-back sessions in the same location. Let's say we have another one that's going to start at 9 a.m. directly. We know that they're probably going to get the people out of this room before 9 a.m. and want to start scanning the next set of people in a little bit before 9. So therefore, you'd want to change this to either -5 or maybe -10. Another case where you need to plan and maybe have some consultations with the client to decide these kind of things if they are going to schedule back-to-back sessions in the same room. So with a -10 offset here, what would happen is any scan that came into this location up until 8:50 a.m. would count towards this session. And then anything after that would not count towards this session. It may count towards the next session if the next session had a -10 start offset in that case.
I just want to say too, that's somewhere where some clients, Microsoft comes to mind, where they take attendance very seriously. Microsoft usually requests us to make that offset -10 or -15 because they track that attendance and they don't want someone sneaking in 5 minutes before the end of the class and getting credit. So they'll often ask us to roll that back so that people who sneak in at the end aren't counted.
Okay, then there's a few other fields here. These are pretty advanced things, I would say, that are not used that often. So I'll just skip over that.
Skip over them, yeah.
Aux fields as well. You get 10 aux fields for sessions. Commonly, people will store like which track a session belongs to, that kind of thing in these fields for later reporting. But that's all we need to fill in to create a session. So I can hit save. And now there's our session. So it's defaulted us now to the session dashboard screen. So this is where you can watch and see how many people have been admitted, granted, denied, waitlisted, etc. I should probably quickly talk over these. So, and it'll also show you here too, if scanning is currently running, if it's ended. So because I entered this in the past, scanning ended an hour ago. So the rule types Chris mentioned, and actually this is where you would set those up. If someone gets scanned in because they were granted based on a code, that'll give a +1 here. If the person was denied, but deny overrides were allowed on the session, so the staff hit deny override, that means they did go into the session, but they weren't granted, so they were denied override. So that would add 1 to this count. And same thing with wait listing. If they were waitlisted, but then there was enough space in the session, and then they let some of the waitlisted people in by a waitlist override, that adds 1 to this count. So the terminology we came up with to indicate how many people actually went into the room was the term admitted. So in the tooltip, we'll show you that here, but admitted is the sum of these 3 different types of ways that you can be admitted to the room. So this is probably the most valuable count people are going to be interested in for a session. But
just a side note here too, as you can see, there's many areas in Sentinel where there are tooltips. So a lot of answers and questions that are asked can often be answered just by simply looking at the tooltip in a lot of cases.
Yeah, you wouldn't believe how many times people send me a question and the answer was right there in the tooltip. They just didn't mouse over it. And this would be a good example. People ask me, how do you come up with that number? Well, it says right there. And it's a good point as well. I mean, when I do get questions like that, if it's somewhere where there isn't a tooltip, it's something where I go and it takes a minute to go and add a tooltip. So it's something where I'll go and add them. So if you guys, in the course of what you're doing, see areas where it's commonly confusing people and a few tooltips could be added, just send me the spots and what text you think should be added, and it's really easy to add them. A few other statistics here, the total scans. So the difference, of course, with the total scans and admitted is somebody goes in and then they go out, go to the bathroom, they come back again and we scan them again. Or sometimes, you've got staff that don't even realize the scan worked and they scan somebody 3 times, whatever the case is. Every single scan will go into the total scans. But that's sort of a meaningless number. That's really just for us to see. What is really important is how many people went in that were unique. Actually, I guess that's something I didn't mention as well, but this is the unique number of people. So if somebody comes in and out a few times, they're only going to count once towards the admitted count. Then scans per minute. This is the most common metric that I use to determine how busy a session may be. The number of active devices. So that's how many devices are actively syncing that have been set to the location that this session is at. The capacity, if it's been entered, and if the capacity has been entered, then we can also determine the percentage full of that session. The rules, I'll show you how to create the rules quickly. Actually, step through the tabs in order here, I guess. So the details, you don't often need to look at this, but this will show you all the details of the session without having to go back to the edit screen. You can quickly link to the location of the venue from here. The advanced section is an interesting one though too, because you can see who created it, when it was last updated. So if these are getting created via a third-party sync service or something, you would see that here, that it was the sync service, what time it was created, when it was last updated. And you can also compare the times in UTC. So these are the times that are actually stored in the database for this session, 3 p.m. and 4 p.m. because we said it was a Pacific time event. But what the time actually locally at that event and what is going to be displayed everywhere on all the screens is going to be 8 a.m. to 9 a.m. But for debugging purposes, you can come and see what the actual UTC times were. And you can also see the offset of the event here as well. Just it's something you quite often need for debugging.
And maybe a quick question on this one as well. So data for sessions, is that only shown in the apps, or is it also shown on different locations? Because do for example, the web science also use Sentinel data for session locations, or how does that work?
Well, in the app, you'll see the name and the code of the session and things like that when you're scanning it. but you won't see any of this other detail. Like the apps, they're really kind of like a dumb device in this case, because we send them as little of data as possible that they need in order to make everything run more efficiently. So like, for example, the aux fields, the description of the session, none of that is sent to the apps because they don't need any of that.
And is that only shown then in this CMS or also on different locations?
So right now, this is the only place where you can see all those kind of things, the Sentinel backend web admin UI.
Okay, no, great. Just wanted to make sure that if, for example, you would fill in, for example, in the description, something that's relevant for you that is not impacting, for example, the website or any other area. So wanted to make sure.
Yeah, that's like, so the description is just the description of the session. Often we'll get it in the Excel upload, so we might as well save it there. But yeah, it's not visible on the app. Sometimes it's hundreds of characters, and when you're talking about potentially 1,000 sessions, that's a lot of data to have to transfer to the devices. So that was an area where we spent a lot of time making the data as compact as possible.
Yeah, and concerning those offsets, I'm guessing that if you would have an overlap, so let's say, like you were explaining, this session says scan end offset is 10 minutes. If the next session would have a scan start offset of -15, then you have an overlap. I'm assuming that you don't get an error message saying that something is wrong.
Yeah, so, and you can see it shows you the actual times here with the calculation of the offsets as well. So yeah, you're right, that would create an overlap, but you would get a warning message when you created or uploaded the session saying,
okay, you would. Nice.
Yeah, if you like, what happens quite often is you get 100 or maybe several hundreds of sessions and you upload them all. The upload screen will give you a whole list of warnings of exactly every code and time and location of every session that overlaps with another session, and it gives you the whole list. And at that point, you'd have to go through and decide. Like, the reason why we don't disallow the upload is because often the client will send us data with tons of overlaps in it already. And sometimes, like, Microsoft events are a good example of this. Sometimes they send us hundreds of sessions that we're not responsible for scanning those because they're just little kind of pop-up things in theaters and things out in the show floor. But the times of those all overlap, and it's something that we don't care about because we're not scanning them anyway. So I wouldn't want to force people to have to fix all the times of those kind of things. So that's why we give warnings. So, that's another area where you guys can help us with, because unfortunately, you'd think giving people warnings, hey, you've got overlaps in all your sessions, would make people go and fix them. But a lot of times that's not the case. A lot of times those warnings have just been ignored, unfortunately. And then we have a lot of problems to deal with after the fact.
Yeah.
And
Great, apologies to interrupt.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, Tace. Sorry, guys. I was just going to say we can probably spend probably 30 minutes on this whole subject of session offsets and overlaps, and we'll definitely schedule, I think, a different discussion for this subject in its own right, as well as other sessions, I think, on just importing best practice, importing approaches, importing allow lists, things like that. So we're kind of running short here. We can go another 10, 15 minutes if it's okay with you guys, but I just wanted Greg to give you kind of a start to finish quick overview of working within the session application, how it worked.
Yeah, I was kind of thinking that too. The next thing I would go to would be the rules, but we could probably spend a half an hour just on rules alone.
Yeah, absolutely.
Maybe
we've got many other sessions planned in the future, so we can cover all these separately. We'll come up with the subjects. But
do you want to just do a quick kind of run through of what we haven't seen so far?
Yeah, super quick, Greg, please.
So here's how you'd add a rule. There's the the different types you can add. If you want to add a grant rule, you'd have to add it with the code. Now, where that gets complicated is when you have multiple rules on the same session. Some of them may have conflicting logic and things like that. So we'll go over that another time. This tab shows you all the scans that have happened at that session. So that's a really good place to track down, because you're going to get asked quite often, has this person scanned into this session, yes, or not, that kind of thing. You can export the scans from a session. You can edit the session, of course. So that's it for sessions. Devices, you can see all the devices that
Test is a little slower.
yeah, so what happens is anytime we've released a new version to an environment, if you're the first one to hit a screen, it'll go a little slower like that. So that was the case. Obviously, nobody's looked at the devices screen and test for a while. So there's no devices active for this event because we just imported it earlier, so that makes sense. But as soon as you activate a device, you'd see it in this list. At some events, this list can get quite large. It can be like at Inspire, for example, I think we had 600 devices there. But this gives you a place you can track down a specific device and monitor the battery level is a big thing. It'll give you color-coded numbers here showing you which ones are running low on battery and you may need to go run and replace. Also knowing the last sync date is important too. If you had to make a change, then you'd know which devices have synced after it because you can see all the last time they've synced. Every device is syncing automatically on a 5 or 10 minute interval and getting all of the changes for data that it may need, like any change to a session that it may need to scan at, or allow list is a big one because allow list is constantly changing. The assignments, we use this at some events. What this allows is that if staff have badges, well, even if they don't have badges and you're willing to type in their names every time you assign one, you can use this as well. But when they have badges, it's the easiest because the app has a feature where you can sign out the device, scan that staff's badge, and then the back end has a complete record of which staff had which device from which time to what and which locations they went to. So at large events where there's hundreds of devices out there, you can sign them out in the morning, sign them back in when they return them, and we know right away which devices are left, who had them, where they were at. So it's very handy at events with a large number of devices. The deny list, so badges can be deny listed. You can see that nobody's hit this screen in a while either. So there's a few different ways they can get deny listed, but the most common is in Insignia. I can show you that another time, but there's a way to look up a badge in Insignia and you can, there's an option there to deny list it, and then that will send it to Sentinel. Every badge has something called what we call a tag UID, which is a unique manufactured ID in the NFC chip in the badge. So once we've deny listed that, it doesn't matter. You could scrape the name off the front of it. It doesn't matter. It's still going to be deny listed. Based on that unique ID in the chip.
Yeah, this feature is not used very often, and for lots of reasons, we can cover that.
Yeah, that's a more advanced
list session.
Another time as
very
well.
Advanced.
Yeah, we can do auto deny listing, but I recommend against it. There's a few events that use it, like Mobile World Congress, so we can get into that another time. So we can probably skip over some of the other apps for now. So there's Swag. You set up your Swag configs to distribute items, backpacks, all that kind of stuff. You can look at the Swag scans, and then same thing with point of sale is used even less. It was used at IBC for the first time this year. So there's separate configs and scans for those apps as well. But yeah, they're lesser used, so we can skip over those in the interest of time now.
Yeah, Greg, can you just touch quickly on just the data structure itself in Sentinel? I think that's kind of important. So maybe another session as well in it, but I think it's important to understand kind of how data is stored and saved and structured.
Not totally sure what you mean.
Like as far as the difference between sessions being separated from the actual record itself, as opposed to a scan having all the associated information.
Oh, I see. Okay, yeah. So
yeah,
yeah, we do something a little bit unique in Sentinel, where when a scan is saved, the scan gets saved with the location it was at and the time. So there's no session saved along with the scan. So in order to associate the scan to a session, when you ask, like when you go to a session and you go to this tab, show me all the scans at this session, what it's actually doing is querying the scans table for all the scans that have happened between the valid times for this session at this location. So all the scans between 7:30 a.m. to 8:50 a.m. that happened at location 1 would go into this grid. And you may wonder why we do that. There's pros and cons to that. But the big thing is that it makes it very easy to fix data problems later. Like one example that comes to mind is the one where the PM uploaded the sessions for the entire event with the wrong year. So, and then didn't realize until after the event was already over. All we had to do is come and upload a new set of, export the sessions, change the year, re-upload them, and everything was just automatically fixed as a result. And then also the cases where you need to change offsets, you realize after the fact, all of the scans get automatically picked up as a result of you doing that without having to change anything in the actual scans table. So the cons to it are it takes reports a little bit longer and more complex to run and things like that. But so that's I guess it's an important thing to know about how it's working under the hood.
Yeah, we'll spend a little bit more time on that, just visualizing the data so you can understand how it's normalized. But the other piece too that's important to understand and also know for informational purposes is that there's no PII stored in Sentinel. So all we store is just the badge ID, UID, and first name, last name.
Right, and so you can see PII in Sentinel sometimes, but the way that it gets that is it pulls it from a service from Insignia. So if you're looking at a scan, like an individual scan screen, and you'll see it, we'll be able to show the person's company and job title and all that. None of that, as Chris mentioned, is stored in Sentinel. It pulls that dynamically via an API from Insignia in order to display it. So the nice thing about that is that there's nothing to have to remove or worry about in Sentinel as far as PII or GDPR or anything like that goes.
Yeah, very important concept. Okay. All right, well, I think that wraps it up, unfortunately. We could go on for hours yet, but I think what we'll do is just break it up into various subjects and areas of Sentinel. Also sessions on the apps themselves and going through that. And then I know there's questions as well, so maybe we'll, David drop some questions which we'll respond to after this in one of our Slack channels. And then any other questions, guys, just follow up, message myself or in our channel that I've added YouTube and Sentinel. And that's all we have for today. I'm just going to stop recording.